Hi, welcome to my channel. I'm Courtney, and in today's video, I'm going to show you our entire process of making sauce from fresh garden tomatoes from harvest to jar. I'm going to be picking Roma paste tomatoes today and San Marzano tomatoes to make sauce. And they've been kind of trickling in before the great big harvest of ripe tomatoes all at once. So I have enough to make a smaller batch of sauce today. And I've also frozen some of these tomatoes because I didn't have time to make sauce when they first started trickling in, which is completely fine because you can make delicious sauce out of frozen tomatoes and salsa. And I've got videos about that, which I can link to this video if you'd like to check them out. But I'm going to get picking here. Next week it's going to be 97 degrees and humid, so I know the heat index is going to be well over 100. So I'm taking advantage of a slightly cooler day to come out here and pick. So I'm just going to pick the most ripe tomatoes that we have. These are San Marzanos, and they're absolutely perfect for sauce. And you can see the Romas are a little bit different, but not much different. They both make very delicious sauce, in my opinion. And these tomatoes will ripen just fine inside too. They don't necessarily need sunlight to ripen, but if you have a warm spot in your house that you can set them, they will ripen inside just fine and the flavor doesn't change. So some of these that are laying on the ground, I'm just going to pick up and bring inside. In a couple of days, they'll be ripe. And if I need to freeze them, then that's fine too. But because right now, today, we're getting the most ripe tomatoes we have to make the fresh sauce with. Okay, this is the other side of the bed. You can see that the plants are struggling now, and I have neglected pruning this bed right here because this is the time of year where it's just so hot and I get so busy, so I really can't keep up with perfectly pruning these plants, but we still have a very decent amount of tomatoes coming on, even though the plants are kind of struggling. So you can see all these beautiful ripe tomatoes. I'm going to pull, and they're going into our sauce in just a few minutes. With the 60 pounds of Roma and San Marzano paste tomatoes that we picked, we made 8.5 quart jars of sauce. This sauce was a little bit thicker. It took about 3.5 hours for us to cook it down. We cooked it down about halfway. If you like a thinner sauce, you can average about 5 pounds of tomatoes per quart jar. The first thing I do after I harvest my tomatoes is I set up my workspace outside. I do this outside just because I've got the hose out here and it's a lot less messy than it is doing it inside in the sink. So I basically just set up my table outside. On one end of the table is my tomato machine, and then I have a bin to catch the waste. Then I've got my cutting board with a sharp knife so that I can cut all of the bad spots off of the tomatoes. Then I've got a nice big bin that I can clean the tomatoes in. And then I've got my great big bin of all of the tomatoes that I just harvested. This is the bin I use to clean the tomatoes. I like to use a shallow bin as opposed to a deep one because you can spread the tomatoes out and really spray them well with the hose to get them clean. I also give them a good scrub with my hands while they're soaking. I change the water between each round of tomatoes that I load into this bin. You can reuse each load of water by watering your garden. As I'm cleaning the tomatoes, I go through and see if there are any that feel soft or rotten, and I toss those out. If there are small bad spots on the tomatoes or little cracks or spots from an insect, I don't worry about tossing those out. I do cut the bad spots out and see what the rest of the tomato looks like on the inside. If it looks good, I'll still use it. This brings me to talk about the process of canning tomato sauce and the safety of it. If you'd like to read more about this, I would recommend University Extension publications. There's a degree of uncertainty when it comes to the pH of tomatoes because lots of conditions can reduce the acidity of tomatoes, like insects, cracks, bruises, tomatoes ripening off the vine, over-ripened tomatoes, tomatoes attached to dead vines, and just simply the variety of the tomato. All home-preserved tomatoes need to have a pH of 4.6 or lower to be safe. If I were to toss out all of our tomatoes with signs of blemishes, or if I were to worry about how they were ripened, I would hardly end up with any tomatoes to make sauce out of. Organically grown tomatoes in the garden are just hardly ever perfect, although the flavor is perfect. So for peace of mind, we go the extra mile during the canning process. I'll show you our process later on in this video. Of course, there are many methods of making sauce and canning tomatoes, and I would love it if you'd like to share yours in the comments here. I feel like no matter how long we've been gardening and preserving our food, we're always learning, and hearing about other gardeners' experiences is valuable. You don't necessarily have to stick with just paste tomatoes to make sauce, although they're really meaty tomatoes that produce a thicker sauce. If you have a variety, you could absolutely use them for sauce, in my opinion. Right now we're working with Roma and San Marzano paste tomatoes, but if we have extra Skyway slicing tomatoes or even our larger sized cherry tomatoes, we'll throw those in along with our paste tomatoes. We usually grow around 20 Roma plants, 4 San Marzano, 8 Skyway, and 3 cherry plants every year. This year we have 4 less Roma because we lost them to disease early on. We might end up with less tomatoes this year just because of how the season has been going, but we should still have a decent amount of sauce given the amount of plants we grow. The past 4 years, we've been lucky enough to have bumper crop years where we processed hundreds of pounds of tomatoes each summer. Last summer we purchased our tomato machine. This tomato machine just saves so much time and effort. We can run the fresh tomatoes right through it. We don't have to core them. We don't have to remove anything except for the bad spots, and then we just put them right through the tomato machine. You'll see how easy this is right here. If you're working with smaller amounts of tomatoes and you're working with a hand food mill, the extra step that you would have is boiling the tomatoes so that they're soft enough to work through the food mill by hand. But if you've got your tomato machine, it has that extra power that all you have to do is just feed them through, and you don't need to boil them because it can handle the fresh tomatoes going right through. You can see how this tomato machine saves so much time and effort, especially if you're processing hundreds of pounds of tomatoes. The machine we chose is the Fabio Leonardi MR10 1.5 horsepower SP5. It has no problem milling fresh tomatoes that can fit down into the chute. If you're making sauce from frozen tomatoes, however, they can't be frozen or they'll damage the machine, so they just need to be thawed before running through it. Now we have our 20-quart pot of sauce ready to go, so we're just going to bring it inside and start to cook the sauce down. We cooked this batch of sauce down to about half, which took around 3.5 hours. The amount of time and thickness of your sauce, of course, is totally up to you. Sometimes we want a thinner sauce and sometimes we want a thicker one, depending on what we're using it for. Some like to roast their tomatoes before they make their sauce because it produces a thicker sauce and, of course, that roasted flavor. The reason why we don't go that route is space and time and the amount of tomatoes we're dealing with from our garden. We also don't flavor our sauce with anything at this stage because we like the versatility of a plain sauce that we can adjust when we open the jar and use it in a recipe. I personally could just eat this sauce totally plain with just a little bit of salt because the garden tomatoes are so flavorful on their own. If you do decide to flavor your sauce or add anything else to it besides dry herbs or spices, I would recommend looking at the recipes that have been tested for safety from Ball or a university extension. When you see your sauce starting to approach the consistency that you like, then you can start getting your jars ready for canning. Right here is where we're adding a half teaspoon of citric acid to our quart jars before we fill them with our sauce to ensure a pH below 4.6. Even though we're pressure canning our sauce, we still take this extra step because of the variables I was talking about earlier in this video. These are hot sterilized jars that have been washed in the dishwasher, then heated in the oven at 250 degrees Fahrenheit. Some prefer to sterilize their jars in boiling water in the canner first. Here, I'll show you our process of filling the jars and loading them into the canner. I'm filling the hot jars with our hot sauce that just finished cooking. I also double check the headspace with a headspace measuring tool, and in this case, the headspace will be 1 inch. Then I stir the sauce gently to remove air bubbles and wipe the rims well with a damp cloth, which helps increase the chances of the lid sealing. I place the hot lids on the jars, then I put the bands on and make sure they're no more than fingertip tight. Finally, I load the quart jars into the pressure canner that has a couple of inches of boiling water all ready to go. Some people ask why we pressure can our sauce instead of water bath can our sauce when water bath canning is indeed perfectly fine for tomato sauce. For us, it's just a personal preference. At our elevation, it takes 45 minutes to water bath can tomato sauce, and it takes 15 minutes in the pressure canner. So it takes a lot less time in the pressure canner, and it's a lot easier for us just to set it up on the stove and get it ready and process it for 15 minutes. It does take some time for it to cool down, but we just go about our business while it's cooling down, and then we can open it up whenever we get to it. But for water bath canning, for us, when it processes for 45 minutes, it seems like the water evaporates or splashes out, so even with the lid on. So we have to babysit the water and make sure the water level is just right, and we have to add more water sometimes, and it just gets kind of confusing with the processing time. So it's just a lot easier and more efficient for us personally to pressure can our sauce, but either method is perfectly fine. If you're new to using a pressure canner, you'll want to follow the instructions that came with it very closely. Ours is a weighted gauge pressure canner. We balance the lid, lock it, and turn up the heat until a steady stream of steam begins to escape through the vent. We then add our regulator with the appropriate amount of weight, which is 15 psi here. The pressure regulator rocks constantly until we gradually reduce the heat until it rocks around 1 to 3 times per minute. Then we set our timer, in this case it's 15 minutes. You'll want to check your pounds of pressure for pressure canning based on your altitude because it needs to be increased at higher altitudes. When it's all said and done, after 3.5 hours of cooking down, we ended up with 8 quart jars and 1 pint jar of sauce. Now, our pressure canner only holds 7 quart jars, so we have 1 quart jar and 1 pint jar that we'll put in the refrigerator that we'll certainly use within the next few weeks. Thank you for watching. Wherever you are in your gardening journey, I hope you enjoyed this video and hope you'll join me for more content from our garden. Please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons.